None of this would have happened without Vanessa, my son said as the entire restaurant lifted their champagne glasses toward my daughter-in-law, while I sat there smiling with my hands folded quietly in my lap. Even though I was the one who had paid every dollar of my grandson's college tuition for the last 4 years. I remember the sound of the applause more than anything else. It echoed softly against the tall windows of the private dining room at the country club, blending with the clinking silverware and the low jazz music drifting through hidden speakers. Lucas looked proud sitting at the center of the long table in his navy blazer from Northeastern University, his graduation stole draped carefully over the back of his chair. My grandson had graduated magna cum laude that afternoon, and I had never felt so proud of anyone in my life. I had watched that boy grow from a quiet child who loved dinosaurs and grilled cheese sandwiches into a young man preparing for law school. I had paid for his preschool when Daniel and Vanessa were struggling financially. I had bought his first laptop when he started high school. I had sat in emergency rooms with him when he broke his wrist skateboarding at 14. And 4 years earlier, when Daniel called me late one night, sounding embarrassed and defeated, I had quietly offered to pay Lucas's tuition so he would never start adult life buried in debt. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you," Daniel had whispered over the phone back then. "One day Lucas will understand what you did for him." But people change slowly. That's the dangerous thing about betrayal. It rarely arrives all at once. It enters quietly, dressed in polite smiles and family dinners and Christmas cards. By the time you finally recognize it, it already has a permanent seat at the table. Vanessa sat beside my son that evening wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her diamond earrings caught the warm chandelier light every time she turned her head to accept another compliment. "You must be so proud," one of Daniel's business partners told her. "Putting a kid through college these days is no joke." Vanessa laughed softly and touched Daniel's arm. "We made sacrifices," she said. "But Lucas deserved every opportunity." The words settled into my chest heavier than I expected. I lowered my eyes toward my untouched glass of white wine before anyone could notice the change in my expression. Across the table, Lucas was talking excitedly with his friends about apartments in Boston and LSAT prep courses. He had no idea what was happening around him. That was the part that hurt the most. My grandson wasn't cruel. He simply believed the story he had been given. Daniel stood again after dessert arrived. "I just want to say how proud I am of my wife," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. Vanessa worked tirelessly to help make Lucas's education possible. More applause filled the room. Vanessa leaned her head gently against his shoulder while cameras flashed around them. Someone at the table said, "She's an incredible mother." Another person added, "Not many women would sacrifice that much." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my napkin. Nobody looked at me. Not once. It was strange how invisible a person could become in their own family. I thought about the retirement account I had quietly emptied during Lucas's sophomore year after tuition increased nearly $12,000. I thought about the small lake trip I canceled because I couldn't justify spending money on myself anymore. I thought about clipping grocery coupons at 68 years old, while Vanessa posted photos online from wine tastings in Napa Valley and weekends at luxury spas in Vermont. Daniel knew where the money came from. Every semester, I wired the payments directly. Every semester, he thanked me privately. But public gratitude belonged to Vanessa now because she fit the image they wanted to present to the world. Stylish wife, successful family, perfect parents. There was no room in that image for an aging mother sitting quietly at the edge of the table. "Mom, you okay?" Daniel asked suddenly as people began gathering their coats near the entrance. His voice sounded casual, distracted. I looked up at him and smiled the same smile I had practiced for years whenever something hurt more than I wanted people to know. "Of course," I said gently. It was a beautiful dinner. Vanessa walked over carrying a slice of leftover cake, wrapped neatly by the waiter. "Helen, thank you so much for coming tonight," she said warmly, as though I were some distant family friend invited out of obligation. Then she lowered her voice slightly and added, "Lucas really needed tonight to feel special." I stared at her for a moment longer than necessary. Her perfume smelled like expensive roses and something sharper underneath. "He deserves to feel proud," I replied softly. She smiled without understanding what I meant. Outside, the May air felt cool against my skin as I waited for the valet to bring my car around. Through the restaurant windows, I could still see Daniel with his arm around Vanessa while Lucas laughed beside them. They looked like a family featured in one of those glossy holiday catalogs that arrived in the mail every December. Perfect, polished, complete. And suddenly I realized something that settled deep into my bones with terrifying clarity. I had not just paid for my grandson's education. I had quietly financed my own disappearance from the story of this family. I could not sleep after the dinner at the country club. The applause kept replaying in my head long after I changed into my cotton nightgown and turned off the lights in my bedroom. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa smiling while strangers praised her for sacrifices she had never made. Around 2 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to rest and walked downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove that Daniel had given me 10 Christmases ago. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and stood barefoot by the sink looking out at my backyard. The hydrangeas were beginning to bloom along the fence line, pale blue under the porch light. Noel used to trim those bushes every spring before he passed away. He always said a well-kept yard made a house feel loved. I wrapped both hands around the mug and tried not to think about how empty the house had become over the years. There was a time when Daniel and Lucas practically lived here. Saturday mornings meant pancakes on the griddle and cartoons playing too loudly in the family room. Lucas used to run through the kitchen in superhero pajamas while Daniel sat at the counter drinking coffee and talking about work. Back then, Vanessa still laughed easily. Back then, she still thanked me for helping. I remember the first time Daniel admitted they were struggling financially after Lucas got accepted into Northeastern. He had shown up at my front door one rainy October evening looking exhausted. His suit jacket was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes I had never noticed before. "Mom, tuition is higher than we expected," he confessed quietly while I reheated leftover meatloaf for him in the microwave. "Vanessa is stressed all the time. We do not know how we are going to manage all 4 years." I had reached across the table and squeezed his hand without hesitation. "Lucas should focus on school," I told him. "Let me worry about the rest." Daniel looked at me like a drowning man being handed a life raft. I still remember how his eyes filled with tears when I explained that Noel had left me enough savings to help family if they ever needed it. "I will pay you back," he promised immediately. I laughed softly and told him parents do not keep score with their children. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment everything shifted. Not because of the money itself, but because financial help changes the balance inside families whether people admit it or not. At first, Daniel updated me constantly about Lucas. He called after every semester. He sent me copies of report cards. Sometimes Lucas would even write handwritten thank you notes that I kept folded carefully inside my desk drawer upstairs. But as the years passed, the payments became routine, invisible, expected. Vanessa slowly inserted herself between every conversation. Tuition invoices stopped coming directly to my house and started arriving through email instead. "It is easier if I organize everything," Vanessa explained one afternoon over lunch at her house. "I already manage all the family finances." I believed her because I wanted peace. I always wanted peace. That was my mistake. Around the middle of Lucas's sophomore year, I noticed changes I could not quite explain. Vanessa began referring to the tuition payments as our education planning whenever friends were around. Daniel never corrected her. At Thanksgiving, one of their neighbors complimented Vanessa for working so hard to put Lucas through college, and she accepted the praise with a modest smile while carving turkey at the kitchen island. I waited for Daniel to say something. He stayed silent. That silence lodged itself inside me like a splinter. Small at first, then impossible to ignore. I carried my tea upstairs and sat at the desk in my bedroom, where I kept all my financial papers neatly organized in labeled folders. The tuition records filled almost an entire drawer by themselves. 4 years of wire transfers, bank confirmations, receipts. I ran my fingers slowly across the paperwork while memories surfaced one after another. The year I canceled my trip to Maine because Lucas needed new textbooks and housing fees. The winter I delayed replacing my leaking water heater because tuition increased again. The month I quietly sold most of Noel's antique watch collection after the stock market dipped unexpectedly. Nobody knew about those things. Nobody asked. Families rarely notice sacrifices that happen quietly, especially when they become accustomed to receiving them. I opened the final folder containing the most recent tuition payment from just 3 months earlier. Attached to the confirmation email was a short message from Vanessa. Thank you. We appreciate your continued support. Support. Not generosity. Not love. Not sacrifice. Just support. The language had changed long before I noticed the relationship changing with it. I sat there for a long time staring at those words while dawn slowly brightened the edges of my curtains. Somewhere during those silent, early morning hours, another realization settled over me with painful clarity. Vanessa had not stolen credit for Lucas's education overnight. She had been carefully rewriting the story for years, one polite sentence at a time. And Daniel had allowed it because correcting the lie would have forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth about who had really carried his family all this time. 3 days after the graduation dinner, Vanessa posted a photograph online that finally made something inside me go completely still. I was sitting in my living room early Sunday morning with a blanket over my knees and the local news playing softly in the background when her post appeared on my tablet screen. The photo showed Vanessa and Daniel standing beside Lucas on campus beneath a large stone archway covered in ivy. Lucas was smiling proudly in his graduation robe, while Vanessa held his face gently between her hands like the picture-perfect mother from a magazine advertisement. The caption underneath read, "Years of sacrifice, hard work, and sleepless nights finally paid off. We are so proud of you, Lucas. Dreams really do come true when families stick together." More than 300 people had already liked the post. Comments poured in beneath it every few minutes. "You are such amazing parents. Vanessa, you should be so proud of yourself. Not many mothers would work this hard for their children." I kept scrolling, even though each comment tightened something painfully in my chest. Then Daniel shared the post onto his own page with a single sentence underneath. "Could not have done this without my incredible wife." I stared at those words for a long time. The television continued murmuring in the background while sunlight slowly crept across my hardwood floors. Outside, a lawnmower buzzed somewhere down the street. Everything around me felt painfully ordinary, while my understanding of my own family shifted quietly into something colder. I thought about commenting on the post. Not to embarrass anyone, not to start an argument, just something simple. "Congratulations, Lucas. I am proud of you." But even that suddenly felt complicated. I imagined Vanessa reading it. I imagined the brief tightness around her smile. The private conversation she would later have with Daniel about boundaries and emotional pressure and unnecessary guilt. So instead, I placed the tablet face down on the coffee table and sat there in silence. Around noon, my friend, Carol, called. We had known each other for nearly 40 years after meeting through one of Lucas's elementary school fundraisers back when our boys were still young fathers trying to balance careers and family life. Carol had always been direct in a way I admired. "Helen, I saw the graduation pictures," she said warmly. "You must be so proud of Lucas." "I am," I answered softly. "He worked very hard." There was a short pause on the line before she spoke again, her tone changing slightly. "I had no idea Vanessa was the one paying for everything all these years." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they sounded so natural coming from someone who genuinely believed them. I looked down at my tea growing cold beside me on the end table. "Why would you think that?" I asked carefully. Carol hesitated. "Oh, I just assumed. Daniel talks about how much Vanessa sacrificed for Lucas. And all her posts online make it sound like she carried the whole family financially while he was in school." I closed my eyes briefly. "I see," was all I managed to say. Carol immediately sensed something was wrong. "Helen," she asked quietly, "did I say something upsetting?" I considered telling her everything right then. I considered explaining the tuition payments and the retirement account and the years of silent help nobody ever acknowledged publicly. But the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Pride can be a lonely thing, especially for women raised in my generation. "No," I said gently. "I am just tired." After we hung up, I walked slowly upstairs to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed where I kept old family photographs. There were hundreds of them inside, organized loosely in fading albums and envelopes. Daniel at age 8 holding a baseball glove nearly larger than his body. Lucas asleep on my shoulder during a 4th of July picnic when he was only 3 years old. Vanessa smiling beside me at her bridal shower 20 years earlier. before life became layered with quiet competitions neither of us ever openly acknowledged. I realized then that family stories are not rewritten through dramatic betrayals. They are rewritten through repetition, through carefully edited memories repeated often enough that eventually everyone accepts them as truth. Vanessa understood that better than anyone. She never directly erased me. She simply positioned herself more visibly in every important moment until people naturally stopped looking beyond her. She posted the photos. She hosted the dinners. She told the stories. And slowly, over time, my role became smaller and smaller until I existed mostly in the background like one of those blurred figures in old vacation pictures nobody remembers taking. Late that afternoon, I made myself organize the kitchen just to keep my hands busy. I wiped already clean countertops and rearranged cabinets that did not need rearranging. While putting away a stack of dish towels, my phone buzzed on the counter with a text message from Vanessa. "Thank you again for attending the dinner. Lucas had such a special night. We are grateful for all your support over the years." Support. Again that word. Clean. Careful. Distant. I stared at the message while a strange calm slowly settled over me. Not anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This felt different. Quieter. More permanent. For the first time, I began to understand that what hurt most was not the money or even the stolen credit itself. It was realizing that somewhere along the way, my own son had become comfortable allowing the world to forget who had truly stood behind his family all these years. The following Friday, rain tapped softly against my kitchen windows while I sat at the table sorting through old paperwork I had avoided looking at for years. Connecticut springs always carried that damp, gray chill that seemed to settle into the walls of older houses, and mine suddenly felt heavier than usual. I had spread dozens of documents across the table in careful rows. Tuition records, medical receipts, birthday cards from Lucas, old family photographs with curled corners and fading colors. At some point during the morning, I stopped organizing and simply began remembering. That was the dangerous thing about quiet afternoons. They gave memories too much room to breathe. I found a photograph of Lucas at age 6, standing in front of this very house, holding a pumpkin nearly half his size. His cheeks were red from the cold, and he was missing his 2 front teeth. I remembered how he used to spend entire weekends with me because Daniel and Vanessa were always busy working or attending networking events in the city. Lucas slept in the guest room upstairs beneath glow-in-the-dark stars I had carefully placed on the ceiling just for him. Every Saturday morning, he would climb into my bed before sunrise carrying one stuffed dinosaur under his arm and whisper, "Grandma Helen, are you awake yet?" I smiled despite myself remembering those mornings. Back then, I never questioned my place in the family. I belonged naturally, completely. I made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse while Lucas sat on the kitchen counter swinging his legs and telling me stories about kindergarten drama as though it were international diplomacy. I attended every school concert, every baseball game, every awkward middle school orchestra recital where half the children sounded like frightened cats wrestling violins. Vanessa rarely attended those things unless photographs were involved. She was not cruel exactly. That would have been easier to recognize. Vanessa preferred appearances over intimacy. She liked polished moments people could admire from a distance. Matching holiday outfits, professionally staged family portraits, elegant graduation parties. But real parenting often happens quietly in the spaces nobody photographs. The late-night homework meltdowns, the forgotten science projects, the emergency pharmacy runs when a child wakes up with a fever at midnight. Those moments usually landed with me. I remembered one winter evening during Lucas's freshman year of high school when a snowstorm knocked out power across half the county. Daniel was traveling for work in Chicago, and Vanessa had called me sounding annoyed more than worried because she could not drive home from Manhattan safely. "Could you check on Lucas?" she asked quickly over the phone. "He is probably fine, but the house must be freezing." I drove 20 miles through heavy snow that night because Lucas was alone. I brought blankets, flashlights, canned soup, and an old battery-powered radio Noel used to keep for emergencies. Lucas hugged me so tightly when I arrived that I nearly cried right there in the doorway. We spent the evening wrapped in quilts playing card games beside the fireplace while ice covered the windows outside. I wondered suddenly if Vanessa even remembered that night. Some people experience sacrifice as inconvenience. Others experience it as love. Around lunchtime, I opened one of the old photo albums from Lucas's college years. Almost every picture featured Vanessa prominently at the center. College orientation, parents' weekend, graduation brunches. She always stood nearest to Lucas with one manicured hand resting gently on his shoulder, while Daniel smiled proudly beside them. I appeared occasionally in the background like an afterthought. Half visible, cropped at the edge, I stared at one particular photograph from sophomore year taken outside Lucas's dormitory. Vanessa had posted it online with the caption, "Everything we do is for this young man's future." At the time, I had pressed the small heart button beneath the photo without thinking much about it. Now I noticed something strange. Daniel had commented underneath almost immediately after she posted it. "Could not have done it without you." The comment was nearly 3 years old. 3 years. That meant this rewriting of history had been happening openly for far longer than I wanted to admit. I closed the album slowly and leaned back in my chair. The rain outside had grown heavier, streaking the windows with silver lines. Somewhere deep inside me, pieces of old conversations suddenly began fitting together differently. Vanessa insisting on handling financial emails herself. Daniel growing uncomfortable whenever tuition came up around friends. The careful way they always referred to my help as support, instead of what it truly was. They had reduced my sacrifices into background assistance because acknowledging the full truth would have complicated the image they preferred presenting to the world. Wealthy suburban families love polished narratives. Successful husband, supportive wife, accomplished son. There is no elegant place in that story for an aging mother quietly carrying the financial burden behind the curtain. My eyes drifted toward the hallway where Noel's portrait still hung above the entry table. He had always noticed things I ignored. "People show you who they are in small moments," he used to say. "You just have to stop making excuses for them." At the time, I thought he meant strangers, co-workers, neighbors. I never imagined one day those words would apply to our own son. I gathered the paperwork carefully back into its folders and noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between 2 tuition statements near the bottom of the stack. It was an old printed email from Vanessa dated almost 4 years earlier. I did not even remember saving it. The message itself was short. "Daniel, your mother is becoming too emotionally attached to helping with Lucas. We need better boundaries before she starts expecting recognition every time she contributes something." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. My hand stayed perfectly still against the table while something cold spread slowly through my chest. Not because of the cruelty itself. Cruelty I could have handled. It was the realization that Vanessa had understood exactly what she was doing all along. The following Tuesday afternoon, Lucas showed up at my front door carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees balanced carefully in his hands. I had not expected to see him. Usually after major family events, weeks would pass before anyone visited unless they needed something signed, stored, or quietly handled. When I opened the door, Lucas smiled the same crooked smile he had worn since childhood, and for a moment my heart softened despite everything. "I brought you that vanilla latte you like," he said as he stepped inside. "The one with the extra cinnamon." "You remembered," I replied quietly. "Of course I did." He kicked off his sneakers near the hallway rug exactly the way he always had growing up, and suddenly the house felt younger for the first time in months. We sat together in the kitchen while soft sunlight filtered through the windows above the sink. Lucas talked excitedly about apartment hunting in Boston and preparing for law school applications. He had his grandfather's hands, long fingers constantly moving whenever he became passionate about something. I listened carefully while stirring cream into my coffee, even though my thoughts kept drifting back toward the email still folded inside my bedroom drawer upstairs. At one point, Lucas laughed and shook his head. "Mama's been acting like she survived a war these past 4 years," he said affectionately. "She keeps telling everyone how many sacrifices she made to get me through college." The spoon in my hand stopped moving. Just for a second. Lucas did not notice. He kept talking casually, unaware that each word felt like another quiet stone being placed carefully on my chest. "Dad says she practically carried the whole family financially while I was in school," he continued. "I do not know how they managed, honestly. Tuition prices are insane now." I lowered my eyes toward my coffee cup. Steam curled upward between us in thin white ribbons. "Is that what your father told you?" I asked gently. Lucas nodded immediately. "Yeah. He always says Mom stepped up when things got hard." There was no cruelty in his voice. No manipulation. Just simple belief. That somehow made it worse. I studied his face carefully and realized he truly did not know. Nobody had ever told him the full story because the lie had become easier to maintain than the truth. You must be proud of her then, I said quietly. I am, Lucas answered without hesitation. I mean, I know she can be intense sometimes, but she really held everything together. Held everything together. The words echoed strangely in my mind while memories flashed behind my eyes. The retirement account statements. The canceled vacations. The nights I sat awake recalculating my monthly budget after another tuition increase arrived unexpectedly. Lucas reached across the table and grabbed one of the oatmeal cookies I had baked that morning. You okay, Grandma? He asked suddenly. You seem tired lately. I forced a small smile. I am just getting older, sweetheart. No, he said softly. It feels like something else. The concern in his voice nearly broke me. I turned toward the kitchen window before answering. Outside, the maple trees lining my backyard swayed gently in the late spring breeze. Noel planted those trees the year Daniel graduated high school. Back then our family still felt simple. Honest. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Lucas nodded. Anything. I folded my hands carefully together on the table to keep them steady. If you discovered that something important about your family was not true, would you want to know? Lucas frowned slightly. What do you mean? I said slowly, choosing every word with care. Sometimes people tell stories a certain way for so long that eventually everyone accepts them without questioning where they started. He leaned back slightly in his chair now, confusion replacing the easy warmth he arrived with. Grandma Helen, are you talking about Mom and Dad? I hesitated. For a brief moment, I almost told him everything. I almost walked upstairs, retrieved every tuition statement and wire transfer receipt, and placed them directly into his hands. But then I looked at him sitting there in my kitchen wearing the same hopeful expression he carried as a child whenever he asked difficult questions. Lucas was about to begin his adult life. I could not bear the thought of poisoning him with bitterness before he even stepped into it. No, I said quietly after a long silence. I think I am just feeling sentimental lately. He studied me carefully, as though he sensed something hidden beneath my words. Lucas had always been observant. More observant than either of his parents realized. Well, he said finally, offering me a small smile. For what it is worth, you have always been the one person in this family who made me feel safe. My throat tightened instantly. I looked down at my folded hands because suddenly I could not trust my face. After a few minutes, Lucas stood and carried both coffee cups to the sink despite my protests. Before leaving, he wrapped his arms around me in a long, quiet hug that reminded me painfully of the little boy who once climbed into my lap during thunderstorms. I love you, Grandma, he said softly near my ear. I hope you know that. I held on to him a second, longer than usual before letting go. I love you too. After he left, the house became painfully silent again. I walked slowly upstairs to my bedroom and opened the drawer containing all the tuition records. For the first time, I realized the truth was no longer just about stolen credit or wounded pride. Lucas had built his understanding of family on a carefully manufactured version of reality. And the people responsible for that lie were the very people he trusted most. The next morning, I called my financial advisor before I could lose my nerve. His name was Arthur Bennett, and he had managed Noel's retirement portfolio for nearly 20 years. Arthur answered on the second ring with his usual calm professionalism. Helen, he said warmly, how are you doing? I looked down at the legal folders spread across my dining room table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching tiny dust particles floating quietly in the air. I need to make some changes, I told him. There was a short pause before his tone shifted slightly. What kind of changes? I took a slow breath. I want to freeze the supplemental family trust distributions effective immediately. Silence settled briefly between us. Arthur was too experienced to sound surprised out loud, but I could hear careful caution entering his voice. That is a significant decision. I know. Would you like to discuss your reasoning? I stared toward the framed family portrait hanging near the staircase. It had been taken 6 years earlier on Martha's Vineyard during what was supposed to be a perfect summer vacation. Daniel stood beside Vanessa with his arm around her waist while Lucas smiled brightly between them. I stood at the edge of the photograph wearing a pale blue cardigan, smiling politely like a guest invited at the last minute. At the time, I never noticed how physically separate I looked from the rest of them. Now it was impossible to unsee. No, I answered quietly. I think I have discussed enough things with myself lately. Arthur did not push further. All right, he said gently. I will prepare the paperwork. After we hung up, I sat very still at the table for several minutes. My heart was beating harder than it should have for such a quiet conversation. It felt strange realizing that for years I had confused generosity with obligation. Somewhere along the way, helping my family stopped feeling like a gift freely offered and started feeling like rent I paid to remain emotionally included in their lives. By early afternoon, I had also canceled the automatic monthly transfers I quietly sent to Daniel's household account. The money originally began during Lucas's junior year when Daniel mentioned cash flow problems after refinancing their home. Just temporary pressure, he explained back then. We will stabilize once Vanessa's consulting business expands. Temporary became permanent surprisingly fast. Every month afterward, I transferred $3,000 without discussion. Nobody ever asked if I could afford it comfortably. They simply accepted it the way people accept electricity coming from a wall switch. Invisible until it disappears. 3 days later, Daniel called while I was watering flowers in the backyard. I watched bees drift lazily around the lavender bushes as his name flashed across my phone screen. Hey, Mom, he said casually after I answered. Do you have a minute? Of course. There was rustling on the other end, followed by a long hesitation. I think the bank made some kind of mistake with the transfer this month. I continued watering the flowers slowly. What transfer? Another pause. Smaller this time. More uncomfortable. The monthly support payment. Support. That word again. Oh, I said softly. Yes. I stopped it. Silence flooded the line completely. I could almost hear Daniel trying to reorganize his thoughts in real time. You stopped it, he repeated finally. Why? I adjusted the hose carefully so water reached the flower bed near the fence. I decided it was time to simplify some finances. Mom, we kind of rely on that money. The sentence slipped out before he could soften it. I closed my eyes briefly. Rely. Not appreciate. Not value. Rely. I am sure you and Vanessa will figure things out, I answered gently. Daniel exhaled sharply into the phone. Is this about the graduation dinner? There it was at last. The thing neither of us had wanted to say aloud. Should it be? I asked quietly. He immediately became defensive. Mom, nobody was trying to hurt you. I know. Vanessa was just speaking emotionally. She did a lot for Lucas too. I stared across the yard toward the old wooden swing Noelle built for Lucas years ago. The paint was peeling now from too many winters. I never said she did not, I replied. Then why are you acting like this? The frustration in his voice sounded almost childlike suddenly. That surprised me more than anger would have. Daniel genuinely did not understand why any of this mattered. To him, gratitude existed privately, while public appearances belonged to whoever managed them best. I am not acting any way at all, I said calmly. I am simply making financial adjustments. He lowered his voice then. Vanessa is stressed, Mom. Lucas needs apartment deposits for Boston. We have law school applications coming up. This is not really the best timing. Timing. The word nearly made me laugh. I thought about the years I quietly rearranged my own life around their needs without ever mentioning timing once. The dental work I postponed. The vacations I canceled. The kitchen renovation Noelle and I once planned but never finished because another tuition bill always arrived first. Life rarely chooses convenient moments for difficult realizations, I said softly. Daniel fell silent again. For a brief second, I wondered if he finally understood something deeper beneath my words. Then he sighed heavily. Are you upset about something? I looked up at the bright blue summer sky stretching above my backyard and realized how strange that question sounded after everything. Upset. As though the problem were temporary emotion instead of years of careful erasure. No, Daniel, I answered quietly. I think I am finally beginning to understand something. 2 weeks later, Vanessa hosted what she called an intimate summer dinner for Daniel's business associates at their house in Westport. The invitation arrived through text message instead of a phone call, which somehow felt appropriate considering how carefully formal our relationship had become over the years. We would love for you to come, Vanessa wrote. Lucas will be there too before he leaves for Boston. I almost declined. For several minutes, I stared at the message while standing in my kitchen beside a bowl of peaches slowly ripening on the counter. But something inside me had changed recently. The old instinct to quietly avoid discomfort no longer felt as strong as it once had. "I will be there," I replied simply. The evening air carried the heavy warmth of late July when I arrived at their house. Vanessa had transformed the backyard into something that looked like a magazine spread. White lanterns hung from the trees. Long linen tablecloths stretched across polished outdoor tables. Soft instrumental music floated through hidden speakers near the garden hedges. Every detail was elegant without appearing accidental. Vanessa excelled at creating environments designed to impress people. Guests moved through the patio carrying wine glasses while discussing investment properties, private schools, and summer travel plans. Daniel spotted me first and immediately walked over with a careful smile. "Mom, you made it," he said, kissing my cheek quickly. There was tension beneath his voice now whenever we spoke, like someone walking carefully across thin ice. "Of course," I answered calmly. "It is a beautiful evening." Vanessa approached seconds later wearing a pale green dress that matched the hydrangeas lining the patio. "Helen," she said warmly, air kissing near my face without fully touching me. "You look lovely tonight." "Thank you." Her eyes flickered toward me briefly, searching for something. Perhaps resentment. Perhaps confrontation. Instead, I simply smiled politely and accepted the glass of sparkling water offered by one of the catering staff. Lucas arrived shortly afterward carrying dessert boxes from a bakery in town. The moment he saw me, his expression softened genuinely. "Grandma Helen," he said, hugging me tightly. "I saved you the lemon tart because I know Mom always forgets you hate chocolate mousse." Vanessa laughed lightly from across the patio. "I do not forget," she corrected smoothly. "I just thought maybe tonight you would branch out a little." Such a small comment. Harmless on the surface. Yet somehow it perfectly captured the quiet dynamic that had shaped our relationship for years. My preferences always treated like inconveniences disguised as personality quirks. As the evening continued, guests gathered around the outdoor dining tables while candles flickered softly against the deepening blue sky. Conversation flowed easily around college admissions, economic forecasts, and family milestones. Eventually, someone asked Lucas about law school plans, and pride spread visibly across Daniel's face. "We are excited for him," he announced. "It has taken a lot of sacrifice to get here." Vanessa reached for his hand immediately. "Every late night was worth it," she added gracefully. A woman seated across from them smiled warmly. "Vanessa, you should honestly teach seminars for modern mothers. Daniel tells everyone how hard you worked to put Lucas through college." Several guests nodded approvingly. Someone raised a wine glass toward Vanessa. "To strong mothers," a man declared. Laughter and agreement followed around the table. And suddenly I realized something important. This was not just family mythology anymore. It had become public identity. A carefully polished narrative repeated so many times that even strangers celebrated it confidently. Vanessa lowered her eyes modestly while accepting the praise exactly the way practiced people do when they expect admiration. Daniel smiled beside her without hesitation. Lucas looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. I noticed because, unlike his parents, he still watched faces closely when people spoke. "It was definitely a team effort," Vanessa continued gently. "There were moments I honestly did not know how we would make tuition payments work. Something inside me became very still then. Not angry, not emotional, simply finished. I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate and reached down toward the leather folder resting beside my chair. I had almost left it at home earlier that afternoon. Now I understood why I had brought it. "That must have been difficult," I said softly. The table quieted slightly at the sound of my voice. Vanessa smiled graciously toward me. "It was stressful sometimes, yes." I nodded once. Then I opened the folder. The movement itself was small, almost ordinary. Several neatly organized bank statements rested inside alongside copies of wire transfers, tuition receipts, and financial records spanning for years. I placed the first document gently onto the tablecloth between us. Then another. Then another. The candlelight flickered softly across the papers while silence slowly spread around the entire table. Daniel's face lost color immediately. Vanessa stopped moving altogether. "What is this?" one of the guests asked carefully. I folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at Vanessa for the first time all evening. "The tuition payments," I answered quietly. "Every semester." Nobody spoke. Even the music from the garden speakers suddenly seemed too loud against the silence. Lucas leaned forward slowly, eyes moving across the documents in confusion. "Grandma," he whispered, "what am I looking at?" My throat tightened painfully, but my voice remained calm. "The truth," I said softly. Daniel stared at the papers like a man watching his reflection crack in glass. Vanessa recovered first, though only barely. "Helen," she said carefully, forcing a small laugh, "this really is not the time for financial discussions." I looked at her gently. "You are right," I replied. "The time for honesty should have come much earlier." Lucas picked up one of the statements with trembling fingers. His eyes moved rapidly across the page before lifting slowly toward his father. "Dad," he said quietly, "you knew about this?" And in that moment, beneath the glow of expensive lanterns and carefully curated perfection, the story they had spent years constructing finally began to collapse under the weight of a few simple pieces of paper. For several long seconds after Lucas spoke, nobody at the table moved. The warm summer air suddenly felt unbearably heavy beneath the lantern lights. I could hear silverware clinking faintly somewhere near the catering station in the distance. But at our table the silence settled like wet cement. Daniel opened his mouth once as though he intended to explain everything. Immediately, then closed it again without speaking. Vanessa sat perfectly still beside him with one hand frozen around the stem of her wine glass. Her polished composure had finally cracked just enough for something sharper to show underneath. Fear. Lucas looked down again at the financial statements spread across the linen tablecloth. His face had gone pale beneath the soft amber lights hanging above us. "Dad?" he repeated quietly. "Did Grandma really pay my tuition?" Daniel rubbed both hands slowly across his face before answering. Suddenly, he looked much older than 42. "Lucas," he began carefully, "it is more complicated than that." I watched my grandson's expression change immediately at those words. Disappointment arrived before anger did. "Complicated?" he asked. "These are bank transfers." Vanessa straightened beside him quickly. "Your father is trying to explain that family support came from multiple places over the years." Her voice remained smooth, but the strain beneath it was impossible to miss now. Lucas looked directly at her. "Did you pay my tuition?" Vanessa hesitated for half a second too long. That was all it took. "We sacrificed in different ways," she answered finally. The guests surrounding us exchanged uncomfortable glances while pretending not to stare openly. One woman quietly set down her wine glass. Another man cleared his throat and looked toward the garden as though searching for escape. Perfect suburban dinners are built on the illusion that uncomfortable truths belong somewhere else. Nobody knows what to do once honesty actually arrives at the table. Lucas slowly placed the bank statement back down in front of him. "So the answer is no." Daniel leaned forward immediately. "Lucas, listen to me. Your mother supported this family emotionally through all of it." I almost closed my eyes at that sentence. Not because it was entirely false, but because of how desperately he reached for anything that could preserve the version of reality they had spent years building together. Vanessa spoke again before Lucas could respond. "I never asked your grandmother to make this into some public performance." Her words were directed toward me. Now, cool and controlled despite the tension tightening her jaw. "Helen, if you felt unappreciated, you could have spoken privately instead of humiliating everyone in front of guests." Humiliating. The words settled strangely in my chest because it revealed exactly how differently we understood the evening. Vanessa still believed the problem was exposure rather than deception itself. I folded my hands calmly together in my lap. "I did not come here intending to humiliate anyone," I said softly. "Then why bring the paperwork?" she asked sharply. "Because after years of silence, I realized something important." I looked around the table slowly before continuing. The truth does not become cruel simply because it arrives late. Daniel stared down at the documents while rubbing his forehead with visible exhaustion. "Mom," he said quietly, "we never meant for things to go this far." There it was again. Not an apology, not accountability, just regret that the situation had finally become visible. Lucas looked between his parents like someone trying desperately to recognize familiar faces that suddenly appeared unfamiliar under different lighting. "You both let me believe Mom paid for everything," he said slowly. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa answered immediately. Their silence became answer enough. One of the guests stood awkwardly near the far end of the table. "I think we should probably head out," he murmured toward his wife. Others quietly followed his lead. Chairs shifted against stone patio flooring while uncomfortable goodbyes drifted through the warm night air. Within minutes, the elegant dinner party Vanessa had spent days organizing began dissolving around us piece by piece. I noticed tears gathering quietly in Lucas's eyes then. He blinked them back quickly, embarrassed by his own emotion. "Grandma," he whispered, "why did you never tell me?" That question hurt more than anything else all evening. More than Vanessa's accusations. More than Daniel's silence. I looked at my grandson carefully, seeing both the little boy who once climbed into my lap during thunderstorms and the young man sitting before me, now realizing his family was not who he believed they were. "Because love is not supposed to keep score," I answered gently. "I never wanted gratitude from you." Lucas swallowed hard. "Then what did you want?" I glanced toward Daniel before answering. "I just did not want to disappear." The words settled over the patio quietly. No drama. No raised voices. Just truth finally spoken aloud after years of being carefully avoided. Vanessa looked away first. Daniel stared at the table like a man confronting something about himself he could no longer comfortably ignore. I stood slowly from my chair and gathered the documents back into the leather folder beside me. My movements remained calm and deliberate, the same way Noelle taught me long ago when facing difficult moments. Never rush pain. It only makes people defensive. Lucas stood immediately as though instinctively wanting to stop me from leaving. "Grandma, please wait." I touched his arm gently. "Not tonight, sweetheart." My voice remained soft, but firm. "You deserve time to process this without everyone talking over each other." He nodded slowly, eyes still glassy with confusion and hurt. Daniel finally looked up at me then. "Mom," he said quietly, "I never wanted you to feel erased." I studied my son's face for a long moment. He meant those words sincerely. That was the tragedy of it. People often cause the deepest wounds not through deliberate cruelty, but through years of choosing comfort over honesty until the damage becomes impossible to undo cleanly. "I know," I replied softly, "but intentions do not change outcomes." Then I walked away from the table beneath the glowing lanterns while the carefully constructed image of their perfect family remained behind me, cracked wide open by nothing more than the truth. The morning after the dinner party, I woke before sunrise and sat alone on my back porch wrapped in Noelle's old gray cardigan while the world slowly brightened around me. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and early summer rain. Somewhere in the distance, birds moved through the maple trees lining the neighborhood, their songs soft and ordinary against the quiet ache still lingering inside my chest. I expected to feel victorious after finally speaking the truth aloud. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired. There is a strange grief that comes from realizing the people you loved never truly saw you clearly. Around 8 o'clock, I heard tires crunch slowly across my driveway. A few seconds later, Lucas climbed out of his car wearing yesterday's wrinkled shirt and carrying none of the confidence he usually walked with. He looked like he had not slept at all. I opened the front door before he could knock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Lucas looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and quietly said, "I am sorry." 2 simple words. Honest words. Somehow they carried more weight than every polished speech I had heard from Daniel and Vanessa over the years combined. I stepped aside silently so he could come in. We sat together in the kitchen while morning lights spread slowly across the countertops. Lucas stared down at his hands for a long time before speaking again. "Dad admitted everything after you left," he said quietly. "Not immediately, but eventually." I poured coffee into 2 mugs without interrupting him. "Mom kept saying you embarrassed her in front of everyone," he continued. "But Dad finally told her that none of this would have happened if they had just been honest from the beginning." There was sadness in his voice now, not anger. Sadness is harder to repair because it comes after illusions disappear. "I always thought Mom paid for my education," he admitted softly. "I believed every story they told me." I sat down across from him and pushed one of the coffee mugs gently toward his side of the table. "You were supposed to believe them," I said. "They were your parents." Lucas swallowed hard. Why would they lie about something like that? I looked toward the kitchen window where sunlight touched the garden Noelle once cared for so carefully. Sometimes people become so attached to the version of themselves they want others to admire that they slowly stop noticing the damage it causes. Lucas nodded slowly, though his expression remained distant and wounded. "Dad said you never wanted recognition." I did not. Then why did last night matter so much? That question deserved honesty, real honesty. The kind families often avoid because it sounds too vulnerable once spoken aloud. I folded my hands together and answered carefully. Because there is a difference between not seeking credit and being erased entirely. Lucas lowered his eyes immediately. I could see understanding settling into him piece by piece now. Painful understanding. Grandpa would have hated all of this, he whispered. The mention of Noel tightened something quietly inside me. Yes, I replied softly. He would have. We sat together in silence for several minutes after that. Comfortable silence this time. Honest silence. Finally, Lucas looked up again. I do not know how to fix things with my parents right now, he admitted. You do not have to fix everything immediately, I told him gently. Some truths need time before people can carry them properly. He nodded once. Then his expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. Dad also told me you stopped the monthly support payments. I smiled faintly into my coffee cup. News travels quickly. Mom is furious. I imagine she is. Lucas hesitated before speaking again. Are you going to cut them off completely? The question lingered between us carefully. I thought about Daniel as a little boy learning to ride a bicycle in our old driveway, while Noel jogged beside him with one steady hand on the seat. I thought about every Christmas morning, every family vacation, every ordinary Tuesday dinner when we still believed love alone could keep people honest forever. No, I answered quietly. I am not interested in punishment. Lucas studied me carefully. Then what are you interested in? I looked at him for a long moment before replying. Truth. Dignity. Peace. He nodded slowly as though committing those words to memory. Later that afternoon, after Lucas left, I drove into town to meet with Arthur Bennett again. We sat together in his office overlooking the marina while sailboats drifted slowly across the water beyond the windows. Arthur adjusted his glasses as I reviewed the updated trust documents spread neatly across his desk. You seem certain about these revisions, he observed gently. I am, I replied. Together, we finalized the creation of a small educational foundation funded through part of Noel's estate. The scholarship would support first-generation law students struggling financially. Lucas would eventually oversee it after completing school himself if he chose to accept the responsibility. And your son? Arthur asked carefully. I looked down at the papers one final time before signing them. Daniel will still receive what Noel intended for him, I said calmly. But inheritance should never replace character. When I returned home that evening, the house no longer felt quite as empty as it once had. Pain still existed, of course. Families do not fracture cleanly. But somewhere beneath the disappointment, something steadier had begun taking root inside me. Not revenge, not bitterness. Clarity. For years, I believed love meant quietly giving until nothing remained of yourself. Now I understood something different. Real love does not demand invisibility in exchange for belonging. And as the last light of sunset faded softly across my backyard, I realized that while money may have paid for Lucas's education, it was the truth that finally taught all of us what family actually meant.